Run while you can. When you can't save others, at least try to save yourself. Arriving at Clinton had been a letdown. Serena had seen it in Brad's face. When it came to the town, there wasn't much to be done. Brad had stopped dead at a burned hulk of timbers and said nothing. His face held a mixture of fury and anguish. His lips worked silently, and his fingers whitened as he gripped the pack on his back. After several moments of silence, he had turned away, which really said everything. His family was gone. So was his home. Max and Annie hadn't said a thing, not even a whine of complaint. They followed as he turned on his heel and marched them towards the east, to the outskirts of town. There they had found the same scene. The only difference was the wide space between the farmhouses. The corpses of horses and of other animals of uncertain breed lay rotting on the ground, spread out randomly across the wide drive. The farmhouse they stopped at was in ruins. Nothing but the blackened bricks of a chimney stood among the collapsed, burned timbers. Nearby, a barn was in the same shape, but several smaller buildings appeared relatively intact, and they ended up bedding down for the night. It wasn't their final destination. A half-collapsed building in the forest marked the end of their journey the following day. A tree had fallen against the house years ago, its branches poking through what were now open holes along the back edge. The house hadn't been occupied in years, and the remains of the front of the property were desecrated with graffiti and empty bottles of beer and whiskey, and it seemed that someone had collected the cigarette butts, arranging them in what were now moldering pyramids, black with mold.
"It's remote," Brad had said. "Off the beaten path."
He shrugged at Serena in what might have been an apologetic way, but he'd been so quiet since seeing the remains of his family's home that she wasn't sure he was even capable of that. His expression had settled into a blank darkness, and he pulled away from her that night, instead staying up to provide watch, despite the proclaimed safety of the location. The first night they slept in the filth and mess. By the next morning, however, Serena was determined to make a go of it. She didn't have long, after all. The baby would be here soon. Any day, by her estimate. So as the dull rays of the sun peeked intermittently through the low cloud cover and the chill of the morning hung around them, she roused Max and Annie and set them to work. Some of the bottles could be rinsed in a nearby creek and made use of. Others could serve as the base for an outdoor cooking pit once the clay soil warmed enough to be dug up and shaped into an oven. By the third day there, they had settled into a routine of sorts. There were plenty of destroyed buildings to pick through. There were only so many clothes or blankets people could take when running for their lives. And from the looks of it, the troops that had blown through the small town had killed anyone foolish enough to stay. Serena thought about what Jess had said as they parted ways. "Don't go to Clinton. There's nothing left there but bones and ash." Jess had been right. There was no one left in Clinton. If there was, they hid themselves well. Most of the homes in their area hadn't even had a good pick-through. Serena had certainly seen her share of empty homes in the past few months as she and Brad had slowly made their way, mostly on foot, from the time they had escaped the Western Front in Mississippi. By now she could tell when one had been picked over versus one that had not. Most of the places they scavenged were untouched, and Serena couldn't help but feel afraid. Untouched did not mean safe, not at all, and she listened carefully for sounds of footsteps, anything really, that would betray the presence of others. No matter how quiet it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The night that they had spent with Jess and the kids was the last snow of the season. It had melted away within days, and the air had warmed quickly. The warmer temps and the discovery of a cache of seeds in a dented old box near the ruins of another farm had curtailed any additional scavenging, and instead became a race to get the ground ready for the spinach, kale, and lettuce seeds. The storm clouds gathered in the west promised them a wet reward, and Brad had pointed out that any seeds they could get in the ground now meant not starving in a few months when their supplies ran out. It was there, in the middle of the fourth row, that Serena had stared down at her legs, confused at the sudden rush of warmth and wetness. She stared at her legs, rooted to the spot, and felt panic wash over her. Why didn't I insist we go with Jess? There was a hospital there, Research Belton. I can't give birth here. Brad, consumed with the work, had moved ahead of her down the row with his shovel. Annie followed behind with a hoe, breaking the dirt up further. Serena felt Max tug at her hand. "Sweena, I plant more?" His hands were covered in dirt. He had followed behind as she carefully dropped seeds at intervals and gently pushed the dirt over them. Brad turned back then, took in the wet pants, and dropped his shovel, pushing past Annie to close the distance between them.
"Is it the baby? Is it time? It isn't those hic contractions again, is it?"
Braxton Hicks. And no, the contractions were coming fast, hard. She stood there, lip trembling, tears running down her face. It's different this time. Way different. Her stomach twisted, and she felt the baby slide down even further, pressing hard against her pelvic bone. Brad was at her side then, holding her steady.
"Okay. It's gonna be okay, babe. We planned for this, remember?"
In a moment of wild optimism 3 days ago, she had told him that women had been giving birth for thousands of years, and all they needed was some hot water, towels, and something to cut the umbilical cord. Prepared? Oh, God. I want a hospital. I want doctors. I want a fucking epidural. Why did I let him talk me into coming to Clinton? Slowly, they moved back to the house, and she gritted her teeth as the next contraction knifed its way through her. That evening, the storm was fully engaged over the pitiful remains of a ghost town once known as Clinton. Lightning flashed, and rain dripped through the roof of a dilapidated house, forming a puddle. Serena screamed at the top of her lungs for anything that could stop the pain. Another push and scream, and the head and shoulders appeared. Brad let go of her hand and reached down to cradle the tiny head, holding the baby as it slid out and coughed. A sharp, thin wail issued from its mouth. He looked past the umbilical cord.
"It's a girl. Baby, we got ourselves a little girl."
He smiled, yet Serena could see he was disappointed. He'd talked endlessly about having a son, and the evening before he had brought home a stack of baby clothes, all in blue. Serena fell back against the blankets, exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. She'd done it all, without a hospital or doctors or even an epidural. She wished her mom was here. Mom hadn't thought much of her, always chiding her for being a delicate flower. She would have been in awe of her girl managing such a feat. Brad gently wiped the baby down, cut the cord, and then wrapped the tiny infant in a clean blanket and handed her to Serena, who looked both excited and exhausted. The lightning lit up the room, and the baby squawked in fear at the loud thunderclap. Serena took in the baby's features, her shock of jet-black hair, and met Brad's steady gaze. He knew the baby wasn't his, didn't he? For just a moment, the same look Brad had on his face when he saw the remains of his family home resurfaced as he stared at the tiny infant swaddled in a soft blanket. But he said nothing, shook his head quietly. Was it sadness? Anger? Hurt? She wasn't sure. She felt a lump of fear and guilt form in her throat. She hadn't ever come out and said the baby was his. But as the months had passed and they had become a family of sorts, he just sort of stepped up. He'd been excited, especially after they found Max huddled alone and starving as they made their way out of Mississippi.
"I always wanted kids,"
he had said, his gaze landing on Annie and Max as they walked down the road hand in hand behind them.
"I guess I never imagined it would be quite like this, though."
She had relaxed a little, hoping for something good to come out of it, and started thinking of Brad as the baby's father. Now she had to wonder, had she been wrong? Would he reject the baby? Hell, maybe reject her as well? He smiled then, reached out and stroked the baby's cheek.
"She's beautiful. What should we name our baby?"
Relief washed over her. "My mother's name was Rebecca. We'll call her Becca for short."
"Becca it is."
It stormed for 2 days, and the wet and the cold returned. Not as bad as it had been in winter, but certainly far from comfortable. They huddled inside, and Brad and Annie handled the meals, while Serena breastfed Becca in a pile of bedding and pillows scavenged from the wreck of a partially burned home nearby. The smell of smoke riddled the bedding, sometimes overwhelmingly so, but Serena soon learned to ignore it. When the storms passed, the warmth of spring returned in earnest. The seeds sprouted and were soon joined by new rows of carrots, parsnips, and potatoes. Serena nursed Becca, and Brad took care to see that she ate plenty of food. Occasionally, when he didn't realize she was watching him, she could see his true feelings on the subject, especially when the standard blue of her newborn eyes began to pale and become the all-too-familiar ice blue. There were quick flashes of anger, possibly resentment, but Serena could see that he was trying hard to push the negative away and focus on the good.
"Which do you think trumps the other? Nature or nurture?"
he asked once, in an offhand way. The kids were outside playing in the warm summer evening, the sun low in the sky. Annie still wasn't talking, but occasionally Max would do something exceptionally cute, in a way only a 3-year-old can do, and Annie would giggle softly. At the moment he was covered in dirt, and so was she, as they dug into the soft earth underneath a nearby tree. It was the day that Becca's eyes had changed, lightened, to the ice blue she remembered so well. She said nothing for a moment. Becca was already fast asleep. She was a good baby, and by the end of 2 months was sleeping well through the night. Serena thought of the monster who had raped her, and wondered, just for a moment, if he was still alive. She hoped not. Men like that, rapists, murderers, they didn't deserve to live. But how Becca had been made, how Jess's son Jacob had been made, that was nature. What happened next was completely within their power. "Nurture," she answered, looking up at him. "It's the one thing we can control." In the gloom, Brad's face was difficult to read, but she saw him nod slowly.
"Yeah, that's what I think too."
Serena saw an opportunity then and took it. "I knew this boy in middle school. He was quiet, shy even, but really sweet when you got to know him. We studied together after school. Totally platonic, just great friends. He had to move, though, out of the area, East Coast. His mom wanted to return to their family there. We kept in contact for years. He finally told me about his dad after the man died in our junior year. He had been a long-haul truck driver. That is, until they sent him away for multiple rapes and murders when Joe was 12. Joe was the gentlest person I ever knew. Once we were walking home from school, and we saw a little squirrel get hit by a car, killed instantly. He insisted we bury it." She paused. "If a kid can have a dad like that and turn out okay, then I have to believe it's nurture." It was a small lie, the story. She hadn't known Joe, not personally. Sure, she'd waved hello to him in the hallways and shared several classes, but he was on the outer edge of her friend's circle. Instead, her best friend Shelley had known him, even kissed him once behind the bleachers on a dare. The rest of it had been true, so really was it a bad thing to lie about? Nonetheless, it had the desired effect. After that quiet summer evening, she hadn't caught him looking at Becca with anger or resentment, which was a relief, to be sure. By the end of summer, they had managed to accrue 6 hens, 3 of which managed to survive a rash of raccoon attacks that stopped abruptly when Brad brought a large roll of chicken wire and reinforced the tiny doghouse turned chicken coop. Brad spent most of the daylight hours ripping the damaged back wall off of the house, patching sections of the roof, and framing in a new section. It wasn't pretty. He wouldn't be winning any architectural awards, but it would keep out the elements, and that was important come winter. They didn't have much in the way of meat, which was a problem. However, the garden had produced more vegetables than they had expected, thanks to the warm temps and regular rain showers. It was a delicate balance. Too much rain, and the plants suffered. Not enough rain, and their growth was stunted. But the growing season had been kind. Even better, Brad and Annie had discovered hundreds of empty, dust-covered canning jars in a church basement a mile to the west. Whatever they could can, and probably even some of the things they shouldn't, had been quickly put up in the old jars with their zinc covers. Serena hoped desperately that they weren't setting themselves up for a nasty case of botulism, but Brad was insistent.
Hell, my mom canned everything, even potatoes, chicken, you name it. If it could fit in a jar, she canned it and we ate it.
Serena had her doubts, but Brad was so self-assured, so certain, that eventually she just went with it. They hit gold in early October, after a particularly violent storm toppled a length of fencing. One adolescent bull wandered away from a small herd that had evaded all of Brad's efforts to catch them now that he was out of bullets. His mistake was fatal. He crossed a section of the downed fence and ended up tangled in the barbed wire. Wet, wounded, and wrapped up like a present, he roared his distress, which woke them in the pre-dawn hours. Serena watched as Brad killed the young bull quickly and efficiently. He definitely knew what he was doing in this department, and he grinned like a schoolboy as he began the butchering process.
Steaks for dinner, babe.
She was thankful for the abruptly cool temperatures. The flies were few and far between, and the mosquitoes had already died off, were hibernating, or whatever mosquitoes do when the temps drop into the 30s and 40s. Serena didn't know or much care, as long as they weren't buzzing her ears at night and raising welts on the kids' arms. Most of the meat had to be smoked in order to preserve it for more than a few days or weeks, and Brad set into doing that. There was already a smoking shed on the property, luckily. Brad had pointed it out when they first arrived. Meat had been in such short supply that he hadn't gotten a chance to smoke any of the fish he caught. There was no need to smoke what they desperately needed in their bellies at the moment. But the bull was a different matter. It wasn't possible to eat the meat before it went bad, even in the colder temps.
I know where I can find some mesquite wood, up there at that Ace Hardware,
he said, as he hacked away at the meat, his knife cutting off strips of steak. They had been eating beef for the better part of a week, and the newness had worn off. Serena was happy to add it to his soup filled with spinach and root vegetables, but she was well and over the thick steaks they had eaten day in and day out.
I saw it near them chimney things when I was over there scavenging.
Chimenea, she corrected, laughing. Becca cooed from her spot on the blankets at the far end of the room and gummed at a piece of dried meat in her hand. She had cut 2 teeth in the past week and had been an angry, fussy mess until Brad had handed her the meat. She had chewed on it constantly, the 2 lower incisors working their way through the gums, a mess of drool and meat juice on her chin.
What?
It's not a chimney, it's a chimenea.
Whatever. Anyway, that's where I saw it.
He flapped a hand at her.
I'm just wondering if going there is such a good idea.
Why? Serena asked, frowning.
Well, I know there's got to be others around here. Seen evidence of them. Stuff moved. Just wish I had bullets for that rifle I brought home last week.
He had found it lying underneath a body, not far from where it appeared, at least from the bodies and spent ammunition, as if the Western Front had engaged a different faction, likely the Allied South. Serena's hands felt clammy, and she could feel her heartbeat increase. Others? As in soldiers? Brad slid his hand around her and pulled her close.
It's just folks who live around here, babe. Nothing to worry about. I'm just being cautious, is all.
Serena still had nightmares. At first they were so bad that she punched and kicked Brad a couple of times, her sleep-addled brain convinced she was back in the camp, back in Tent 5. After months on the road and the birth of Becca, they had slowed down. Instead of having them nearly every night, it had dwindled down to once a week, then once a month. But it made no difference. Unless the others that Brad had seen evidence of were a woman or a child, they weren't safe. She was sure of it. When Brad announced he was heading to scavenge later that day, after washing the blood and gore from his hands, she had asked if he was going by Ace. She hadn't even realized she was biting her lip until the taste of copper flooded her mouth.
Don't worry, babe. I'm not gonna go anywhere near there, he had told her, his eyes avoiding hers. I'll be back in an hour, 2 at tops.
He'd kissed her forehead, turned and walked away, heading into the forest to the northeast. He had devised several routes this way, varying his paths in order to avoid creating a visible path back to their small family. Serena watched him disappear into a thick copse of trees, his brown hair and camo jacket quickly disappearing into the last of the greenery. Soon the leaves would be gone from the trees, and they would have to face a cold winter. Serena found herself wondering yet again if she had made the right choice. Jess had seemed so certain that her home, a large town of over 20,000 people, would still be there. Clinton hadn't even had half of that number, and from the looks of it, those who hadn't fled had died either in the fighting or when the Western Front had done its best to torch the town. Those that were left seemed to have no interest in showing their faces. Between being pregnant and then caring for a newborn, she didn't have an opportunity to get out, but Brad did. He provided her regular updates that were curated, no doubt, to avoid alarming her. 2 months ago, he had come back, scraped up, a black eye and blood on his ripped shirt. She knew he'd been lying when he said that he had fallen, but she hadn't said anything. He'd stayed close to home for weeks after that. By the time the sun slipped behind the trees and darkness set in, Serena knew something terrible had happened. Either he had run into someone armed and dangerous, or he was afraid to return and bring whoever was around back to their small family. She stamped out the fire in the smoke shed and buried the haunches of meat after wrapping it in a sheet. She would have preferred to sink it in the creek, but that was too far of a hike to risk even in the dark. Becca had already fallen asleep, as had Max, but Annie was wide awake, and Serena could see the girl watching her every move, eyes wide, lip trembling. She still didn't speak, not a word, but Serena could tell the girl definitely had something to say. That Brad hadn't returned was a bad sign. They were exposed, unsafe here. Serena cast about in her mind for any potential solutions, her thoughts interrupted by terrifying questions. Was he dead? Whoever had killed him, did they know where she and the kids were? Were they coming for them? Sleep was elusive and fragmented that night and the next, and the one after that. "Where is Brad, Dad?" Max asked. The little boy was relentless, asking over and over until Annie would reach over and put a finger against his lips and shake her head in warning. He wouldn't listen. Becca, only 6 months old, had been fretful and fussy. It wasn't a new tooth. Serena had checked. No, it was Brad's absence and the rising fear in all of them. Becca could sense it the same as the rest of them. Brad would have returned if he could, and by now Serena was sure he was dead. Nothing else explained it. Nothing else made sense. Despite the chill in the air, Serena's hands were clammy with sweat. As the sun set each night, she found herself shaking uncontrollably, her leg muscles tight, ready to run. Day in and day out, the fear did not abate, and she was a shaky, sleep-deprived mess by the time a week had slipped by. Annie tugged at Serena's sleeve. Becca had been fussing and unwilling to take a nap, but the baby had finally collapsed in her mother's arms, drunk on milk and stripped of the energy that had caused her to fuss for nearly 2 hours straight. Serena glanced down at Annie and raised her eyebrows in the gloom. "What?" she whispered, then winced as Becca moved restlessly against her chest. Annie pointed toward the back of the house and tugged again, clearly indicating she wanted Serena to go with her. Serena nodded, turned back to the baby long enough to settle her gently in the bed and pull another blanket over her before she followed the girl into the gloomy interior. Without any intact replacement glass available, Brad had simply boarded over the broken windows. This made the back half of the house dark and somewhat treacherous to walk through thanks to some rotting flooring. The kids slept upstairs and seemed to manage just fine while Serena, Brad, and the baby had occupied the front room near the front door. It meant less privacy, but it was warmer near the fireplace. Max had been complaining about the cold, and Serena had known it was just a matter of time before they would all be crammed into the same room. Winter was here, and with it, the bitter cold. Along the back wall of the house, next to the stairs going up, Brad had patched the wall where a large hole had been knocked out by the tree. His repair job hadn't been pretty, but it had done the trick. Water wasn't getting in, despite some strong storms during the spring and late summer. Annie walked over to one part of the back wall and knelt down, pulling and shoving at a small piece of wood that had been tacked in place. With some effort, she wrenched it up and to the left, and then pointed out the newly made hole. "A way out?" Serena asked. "In case people come for us?" Annie nodded. "That's good thinking, Annie. Thank you." She fought to keep the tremor out of her voice as her stomach dipped, thinking again of Brad, wondering what had happened to him. He's dead. And really, what else do you need to know other than that? She winced at the thought of it, leaned over, and hugged the girl gently. "We'll be okay, Annie. Don't you worry." She sat there for a moment, wishing she could do something to help the girl feel safe. "I think maybe it's time we headed for Belton. Maybe we can find Jess and her family. What do you think?" Annie's head nodded, and the girl, normally so reticent, reached her hands around Serena and hugged her back with a strong grip. It took Serena by surprise. "Okay. Make sure and get a bag together. Keep it by this back wall, and we will just see if we can't plot a course for Belton before it's too cold. Hell, it's already too cold, but what else can I do? Chance staying here all winter without him?" Serena reviewed her options. "I can try staying here and likely starve halfway through the winter. I could try to find whoever is still out there and do whatever it takes to stay alive, or I can take the kids and head for Belton, maybe even Kansas City." She knew the chances of them all surviving the winter were slim to none with the first two options. With a tiny baby and a preschooler, the entire burden of survival would rest on her and Annie's shoulders, and Annie was barely more than a child herself. The chances that whoever was out there would take her and the kids hit her anxiety triggers like nobody's business. Whoever was out there likely killed Brad. The only way they would want to use me or Annie would be nothing better than a return to Tent 5. And Annie already tried to kill herself once before I got her out of there. As for Max and my baby, who knows what they would do? All I know is that I can't risk it. Serena tried to remember how far away Belton was. Some 50, no, close to 60 miles away. Her brain nearly stuttered to a stop as she tried to imagine how they would get there, the four of them, all alone, on foot. How far could a child walk in a day anyway? A brisk walking pace is 3 miles an hour, so figure half of that through mud, off-road, and maybe 6 hours a day of walking per day, tops, between Becca and Max. That was what, a week of walking every day? They would need to carry food, too, and how will I take care of Becca's diapers? Brad hadn't had any luck finding diapers, so they had made do with strips of cloth and safety pins. There were only so many cloths, though. She'd run out just a few days in and have no way to clean or dry more. The image of a baby crying loudly as they made their way through unknown territory was enough to set her shaking uncontrollably. Shit, shit, shit. No matter what she did, no matter how she chose, she couldn't see this ending well. And as the night closed in around them, Becca hugged to her chest, with Max and Annie now spooned against each side of her. Serena was more afraid than she had been in a long time. Serena silently cursed Brad for carving up the tent to use for several projects, including a cover for the front door, which had been hanging on by one hinge and hadn't even been good for anything more than kindling. Without the tent, they were going to be cold. Damn cold, as well as exposed at night as they walked all that way, not to mention the fact that she would have to be carrying Becca, and likely Annie would have to help Max. In the end, just 2 days later, there ended up being no choice at all. They came late in the day. The sun had long vanished behind thick, heavy gray clouds, and the temperature had plummeted. They had just finished eating dinner, a large jar of green beans and onions, along with a side of beef she'd kept in the house. It had begun to turn, but not enough that she was willing to waste it. Becca had slipped off into dreamland, and Max as well curled around the baby, a thumb in his mouth. It was Annie who heard it first, an errant step onto the now frozen ground, and a branch snapped. Her eyes rounded, her head snapping to attention. She froze in the gloom, stiff, alert, and stared back at Serena. Serena said nothing, just pointed to the back of the house and reached for Becca. There was no time to do anything more than slip her sleeping daughter into a backpack, zip it up as far as the surrounding blankets would allow, and try to move without sound to the back of the house where the escape hatch was. Annie passed her, a very sleepy Max in her arms. They could hear voices now, several, and despite the cold, Serena felt a rivulet of sweat trickle down her back as she waited for Annie and then Max to slip through the hole before handing out Becca in the backpack. The sounds they made were small, but in the night they sounded so loud. Luckily, whoever was out there had been drawn to the remains of the bull.
You were right, buddy. Damned if that young bull didn't end up getting snatched,
an older voice commented. He sounded grizzled, old.
I knew that guy wasn't alone either,
a younger voice said from inside the house.
There are more. Got the remains of a vegetable garden over there near the smoke shed. Blankets are still warm, and I smell food.
Serena prayed to whatever gods were still there that Becca would stay asleep. She eased the straps over her shoulders, keeping the pack against her front, and tugged at Annie's arm, pointing in the direction of the trees. They needed cover, and to be out of sight, but there were at least 100 yards to run across open field, something they needed to do as quietly and as quickly as possible, before the men thought to look behind the house. Max, despite his age, seemed to understand enough to keep quiet. He took Annie's hand, and they all began to run.
Got movement, the old man shouted. Buddy, get over here. There's movement in the back field.
Time didn't stop, so much as blur. Serena heard rifle shots and increased her speed, legs flying across the stubbled, uneven ground. Max and Annie fell slightly behind, and Serena didn't falter, couldn't bring herself to slow down in the slightest. In truth, she felt nothing but horror and panic. The rest of the world washed away in white noise. Her only focus was the dark shelter of the trees. They were close, so close, and the fire in her lungs barely registered as she willed her feet to go faster. Becca was making small squawks of distress as the backpack strapped against Serena's chest heaved and thumped with every footfall. She felt, rather than heard, the gunshots. One came close as she entered the woods, hitting the tree next to her head. The bark exploded into shrapnel, and she dove to the right into a thicker part of the woods as an agonizing streak of what felt like an electric shock tore down her left shoulder and arm. Serena didn't allow herself to think of it, or to stop. She just kept running. The men back at the farmhouse continued to shoot. The bullets, such small and seemingly inconsequential things, parted the surrounding air. Behind her, she heard the children doing their best, but losing ground, falling behind more with each moment that passed. Then there was a strangled scream, a thud of a body hitting the ground, and then nothing more than her own feet grinding through the forest, a stampede through the fallen leaves, rustling, sliding. Her arm hurt, a deep ache that finally turned to a throbbing stab of agony. She slowed, the darkness fully encapsulating her now, her breaths hoarse, ragged. She couldn't continue like this. Serena slammed into a tree with her right shoulder and wheeled about, unable to go on. She had run so far and for so long that she could no longer see Annie or Max or anything but the thickness of the trees all around her, even in their leafless state. The sky above was dark, as was the forest that surrounded her. She couldn't even hear the men now. I didn't even try to save them. Oh, God, I just let them fall behind and be shot. Serena felt the guilt surge through her. As she regained her breath, Becca stirred, the sudden lack of movement waking her where the panicked run had not. She whimpered, twisting in the tightness of the backpack and blanket, her tiny feet kicking. Becca quieted quickly when Serena pushed up her shirt and pressed her breast into the baby's mouth. "Shh," she whispered, and Becca's body relaxed against her, slowly nursing before falling back into a deep sleep. While she sat there, her body pressed against the hard, cold ground, Serena listened, trying to ignore the heartbeat that still roared in her ears. Had they stopped? Or were they still following her? It was dark now, so dark that Serena could barely see beyond the small clearing she was in. Worse, it was beginning to snow. If I can get to the highway, walk it at night, I can make better time. And now that it's just me, I can walk faster, maybe twice as fast. She felt another surge of guilt at that last thought. As she slipped Becca off of her breast and struggled to place her inside of the backpack, her left arm burned in agony. She realized then that the wetness on the blanket was blood, and her right hand crept up to feel the wound on her arm. It burned like fire when she touched it, and she hissed at the pain of it. Is the bullet still there? She couldn't tell, but the blood was still coming. She dug into the pack and found one of Becca's spare diaper strips and wrapped it around her arm. That would do until daylight, when she could see it better. Now she just had to figure out where the highway was and get moving. It wouldn't do to stay here. The blood trail would make it all too easy to find her come morning. There was no point in going back. She knew she couldn't help the kids, even if they had survived. She suddenly remembered a story she had read in high school from a former soldier in Vietnam who had been the lone survivor of his regiment.
When you can't save others, at least try to save yourself.
At the time, reading those words, she had been horrified, but now she understood it better. There was no way she could have saved them. Hell, she would be lucky if she could save Becca and herself. Still, the tears tracked down her cheeks, freezing in the cold of the night. She began to walk, her feet slipping on the leaf-covered forest floor, heading west toward the highway. Becca's warmth was heavy and still against her chest. She was thankful that the baby had not been woken, and that she would likely sleep most of the night through while Serena walked. And walked she would until she could move no further. Her life, and Becca's, depended on it. Serena put one foot in front of the other. The mile markers would have told her how far she had come and how close she was, but she was no longer in any shape to read them. She struggled to keep her focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Her left arm was swollen, hot to the touch, and her feet felt like two lead weights soldered crudely on. She'd walked and walked, stopping only to rest, if she could, for a few hours at a time. The snow had continued to fall. This was unusual for the area. Typically, the storms blew through, dumping a couple of inches before moving on, never lasting for more than a day. This snow, however, had turned to sleet, and then back to a powdery fine snow that felt hard and painful. The infection in her arm had begun almost immediately, and it had turned Serena's thoughts to mush, especially once the dull headache had set in. She walked, chewed on a piece of bark from a willow tree, remembering that it could help with pain, and winced at the terrible bitter taste before spitting it out. Pieces of the bark stuck to her tongue. Her mouth was dry, her lips cracked, and after 3 days of walking, she had moved beyond hunger and into something else. Becca cried against her chest, but Serena couldn't help. It had started with a clogged milk duct on the left, and then the fever and infection had set in, and all Becca did was cry when she tried to nurse. Serena ignored her child. It did no good to stop. Every time she did, it was the same. Her breasts were on fire as well now, and there was no sustenance, no respite for the hunger her baby felt. Becca would suck at the breast, flail, and beat at Serena's chest with her tiny fists, and then wail in frustration. She hadn't eaten in over a day. The only thing Serena could do was somehow make it to Belton, and hopefully find Jess or anyone who might help. Jess will help. I know she will. She remembered what Jess had said to her in those quiet moments when the children were playing and Brad was off gathering wood for the fire. Serena had been overcome with fear, afraid of how she would feel about Becca when she was born. She had leaned close to Jess so the others couldn't hear and whispered, "I pray every day that this baby is Brad's, but I know it isn't. It's that bastard's. I know it is." She had looked up, gazed hard into Jess's eyes. "Do you think I'll be able to love it, even if it is from him?" Jess's reply had been simple and direct. Yes. Serena had liked the girl. Why had she listened to Brad? If she had put her foot down, insisted on taking the kids and going with Jess, she wouldn't be here right now. Max and Annie would still be alive. Her mind occupied with these thoughts, Serena barely noticed the sign by the side of the road. It had been cut down and covered up. Only the metal supports jutted out of the ground. As she concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other, her eyes were caught by the sharp stubs barely peeking out of the snow. She stopped, tottering in place for a moment, before she left the road, and she pushed the branches away from it. 5 miles. Just 5 more miles to go. Night was coming, and with it darkness that was impossible to navigate through. Her foot slipped, then the other, and Serena fell. It wasn't the first time. Her knees ached from the impacts of multiple falls. She got up, slow, and continued to walk down the empty road. 1 mile. Another mile. When Serena lost her way in the dark, she slipped hard on the slick macadam, tumbled down the small embankment, and landed, unconscious, in the ditch. She heard nothing. Not the wails of her child, who had somehow been shielded from harm by Serena's body as she rolled down the hill, and certainly not by the 2 young men, who realized with shock that she was still alive. It wasn't until they moved her, jolting her injured arm, that she woke with a scream of pain on her lips.
"It's all right, ma'am. It's all right. We got you. We're going to get you to a doctor. Just hang in there."
The one who said it was young, maybe late teens. He and the other man each had rifles slung over their shoulders. They exchanged glances, one crouching beside her, the other letting out a low whistle as they pried away the blood-encrusted bandage.
"She's in bad shape, Jake. We best get her back to town and have Ridley take a look at her."
Serena struggled to speak. It felt impossible. The world was bright and white, but she felt so heavy, so tired. "What town?"
"Belton,"
was the younger one's quick response.
"Where are you from?"
"Clinton. Tell her."
"Tell who?"
"Just errands." Her words slurred, and Becca, all cried out, gave a pitiful whine in the backpack still strapped to her chest.
"Jess Aronson?"
the one standing above her asked.
"You know Jess?"
Serena managed a small nod before her eyes slid closed. She had done it. She'd managed to get Becca to Belton, and these men would help her find Jess. Becca would be safe. She smiled then, a thread of gratitude and relief intertwined. As she felt herself lifted, Serena relaxed for the first time in more than a week. She was safe now.